We are living in the midst of a structural crisis of our historical system. This is not a mere cyclical downturn that can be remedied by some kind of adjustment to our collective policies. Rather, it is the kind of crisis that comes only once every 500 years or so. I call our historical system the modern world system. Its form is that of a capitalist world economy. It came into existence in the long 16th century in a geographic zone that encompassed large parts of Europe and some parts of the Americas. By the late 19th century, the system's internal drive for constant geographical expansion led it to encompass the entire Earth and thereby create, for the first time in human history, a single global system. In my view, the defining characteristic of a capitalist system is not wage labor or markets or entrepreneurs in search of profit. These features are widespread in history. Rather, it is a characteristic that is true of it alone, the endless accumulation of capital in order to accumulate more capital. There are mechanisms that seriously penalize any actors who seek to operate on the basis of other values. These non-conforming actors are sooner or later eliminated from the scene. All the many institutions of the modern world system operate to promote the endless accumulation of capital. This priority of accumulating capital in order to accumulate still more capital is a quite irrational objective in terms of what is called in English substantive rationality, a concept of Max Weber. It can, of course, be quite rational in terms of what Weber called formal rationality, in the sense of being a system that has the capacity to function for a considerable length of time. Our modern world system has lasted some 500 years and has been extremely successful in terms of its guiding principle of the endless accumulation of capital. However, the ability to operate on this basis has now come to an end. Capitalism is no longer even formally rational. How has capitalism worked in practice? All systems fluctuate, that is, constantly deviate from their point of equilibrium, but there are mechanisms within all systems to push them back to equilibrium. The system can be said to be operating normally and successfully as long as the pressure to return to equilibrium is greater than any pressure to move away from equilibrium. There are many such mechanisms in the modern world system, but two in particular are the most important, the so-called Kondratyev cycles and the hegemonic cycles. And these two cycles have served effectively to maintain equilibrium and to make possible the historical development of the system. The key feature of a Kondratyev cycle that permits endless accumulation of capital in the A phase is that some products obtain a quasi monopoly, which enables producers to sell at prices far above the costs of production. When products are truly competitive, a buyer can always find someone who will sell the products for a penny above cost or even below cost. Real profit requires limits on the free market. There are two conditions to establishing quasi-monopolies. First, the product must be an innovation that meets the needs, real or socially created, of a reasonably large number of willing buyers. And secondly, the quasi-monopoly needs guarantors. At least one powerful state must be willing to use its power to limit the entry of other producers into the world market. By definition, then, if there are quasi-monopolies, the market cannot be free from state involvement. Quasi-monopoly quasi-monopolized products are leading products, meaning that they encompass a reasonably large percentage of the world system's economic activity, including their forward and backward linkages. Quasi-monopolies promote growth throughout the world economy and tend to generate high levels of global employment. The state fulfills its guarantor role in multiple ways. It can take legal measures to ensure the monopoly via the protection of intellectual property, of which the simplest method is the awarding of patents. In addition, the state can offer direct financial assistance for research and development. It can itself be a major purchaser, often at inflated prices. And not least, it can use its geopolitical strength to try to prevent infringements of such quasi-monopolies by producers in other countries. The Kondratyev cycle is, however, a cycle. Quasi-monopolies cannot last forever. Over time, all quasi-monopolies are self-liquidating for one simple reason. Quasi-monopolies are very profitable, and therefore other producers will try very hard to enter the world market in order to share in the benefits. There are many ways to do this. They can try to steal or duplicate technological secrets. They can try to use the geopolitical strength of other states to counter that of the guarantor state. They can mobilize anti-monopolistic sentiments inside the enforcing country. There is an additional problem for the contributors, the controllers of a quasi-monopoly. Work stoppages are very costly given the high demand, and the controllers of a quasi-monopoly are therefore ready to consider wage concessions to their employees as a less costly alternative, at least in the short run. In the longer run, however, these concessions result in a creeping increase in the costs of labor, thereby reducing the overall margin of profit. Sooner or later, then, other potential producers succeed in undermining the quasi-monopoly. It's generally taking 25 to 30 years to do this. With greater competition, sales prices go down, which is a plus for purchasers, but of course negative for sellers. What can the producers of the erstwhile quasi-monopoly then do? One alternative is to shift primary production away from core locations to other zones where historic labor costs are lower. They are trading the advantage of low transactions costs for lower production costs. In the zones into which production has been shifted, this is perceived as national development. It is in reality the transfer to them of industrial production that is no longer super profitable, a plus, but not a super plus. There are other ways in which the erstwhile quasi-monopolists can minimize their losses. They can maintain some part of production in the core zones for niche sub-products, ones that are more difficult to reproduce elsewhere. They can also pressure their workforce to accept lowered income by threatening further relocation of industry with its accompanying unemployment. And they can also shift their investments from the spheres of production and commerce to the financial sphere. Today, we label this shift financialization, as though it were a recent invention rather than a long-standing practice in the Kondratyev B phases. As Brodel has shown, truly successful capitalists are precisely those who are not specialists in either industry, commerce, or finance, but generalists who move between these processes as opportunities arise. The principal way to accumulate in the financial sphere is to lend money to be repaid with interest. The lender profits most from those debtors who overborrow and who therefore repay annually only the interest and not the capital. The debt thereby constantly increases until the overwhelmed debtor declares bankruptcy. Loan mechanisms of this kind essentially reallocate existing capital without creating the capital, new capital. Given the relative rapidity of the bankruptcies, accumulation via financial loans requires ever new sets of debtors. Although these loans are very profitable to the lenders, they have a downside from the point of view of the global capitalist system. They vastly reduce effective demand for all production by draining ever larger amounts of income to repay debts rather than to produce products. The larger the financial loans, the greater the reduction of effective demand, increasing the difficulty of returning to equilibrium. Schumpeter explained how the return to equilibrium and therefore growth has occurred historically. At some low point in the profit cycle, an invention is turned into an innovation, which permits the creation of new leading products, a new leading product that is quasi-monopolized, which in turn is the basis of a renewed expansion of the world economy. It is only when capitalists are located in a world economy, a structure including a multiplicity of states, that entrepreneurs can successfully pursue the endless accumulation of capital. It is this ambivalent relationship of entrepreneurs to the states that explains the utility in a capitalist system of so-called hegemonic cycles. Hegemony in the interstate system refers to the situation in which one state is able to impose on the others system-wide rules that favor relative order in the world system. Disorders, whether they are interstate or civil wars, mafiosi protection rackets, extensive corruption, or rampant petty crime, no doubt yield considerable income to particular groups or individuals, but they are a hindrance to maximizing the accumulation of capital in the system, primarily by destroying infrastructure. Hegemony offers an important side benefit to the hegemonic power state, to the state, to its entrepreneurs, to its ordinary citizens who obtain an outside proportion of the benefits which eludes others. This accounts for the difficulty to maintain the quasi-monopoly of geopolitical power. Now, both Kondratyev cycles and hegemonic cycles are cycles, but they are imperfect cycles. At the end of either cycle, the system has not returned to the starting point. One cannot simply eradicate the growth in the system during the A periods of real value, its geographic scope, and degree of commodification. There's too much resistance from those who have benefited from these expansions. The result is a diminution, but only a partial diminution of the benefits. The system is stagnating rather than regressing. And we can think of this as a process of 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. There's a return to equilibrium, but the equilibrium has moved upward on its principal curves, creating secular trends. And if we measure on the ordinate percentages of some phenomenon and time on the abscissa, the curves are slowly moving towards asymptotes. But the nearer the system is to these asymptotes, the further it is from equilibrium, since one can never cross the asymptote. Once these curves reach about the 80% point, the system begins to oscillate wildly becoming chaotic. And what happens then is that the curves bifurcate. This then is the moment of structural crisis of the system. A structural crisis is one in which there is only one certainty, that the existing system cannot be brought back to equilibrium and therefore cannot survive. In effect, there exists at this point a collective choice between two alternative and indeed quite opposite new stable systems. It is historically impossible, intrinsically impossible, to predict which of the two will be collectively chosen, and it takes some time to complete the process, but eventually there's a definitive tilt towards one or of the two alternatives. What accounts for the fact that it's only now that the modern world system has moved so far from equilibrium, that it's reached this point? It has resulted from the way in which capital accumulation works in a capitalist system. The basic method is via production, in which the entrepreneur-producer receives as profit the difference between the sales price and the costs of production. And how does the producer minimize the three generic costs of production? Personnel costs, the cost of inputs, and taxation. Well, costs of inputs of personnel differ for three groups: the unskilled and semi-skilled workforce, the skilled workers and supervisory cadres, and the top managers. In the case of the unskilled workers, their rising costs due to syndical action have been contained primarily by the runaway factory, that is, the relocation of production processes into historically lower wage areas in the B period. The wages are historically lower because the workers are recruited from rural zones where their real income has been even lower than the transplanted urban production process offers. Seemingly a classic win-win situation. Once, however, the transplanted workers have adjusted to their new life situation and become aware of the low level of their wages in worldwide as opposed to local terms, they begin to seek better conditions via some syndical action. Sooner or later, the costs again become too high and lead to a further move. Worldwide, the result is a ratchet effect, the reductions never eliminating totally the increases. The key problem is that over 500 years, this runaway technique has more or less run out of new areas into which to move, a phenomenon that can be measured by the deruralization of the world system, quite dramatic in the last 50 years. Meanwhile, the cost of cadres has also risen for two reasons. One, the ever larger scale of productive units requires more intermediate personnel, and two, more cadres are needed to counter the syndical organization of the low-skilled personnel. Such cadres are not only worldwide allies of the top managers, but can also serve as models of the possibility of upward mobility, thereby blunting the political mobilization of the unskilled workers. The rise in overall payments to the top managers has been spectacular, particularly recently. It has been justified by the increased complexity of entrepreneurial structures. But the basic reason is the famous separation of ownership and control, which has made it possible for the top managers to appropriate rent from the firm's receipts, thereby denying income to the owner's shareholders. The costs of inputs have also been going up. Capitalists externalize as many costs as they can. That is, they seek not to pay fully for the inputs they use. In particular, they externalize to the extent they can the disposal of toxic waste, the renewal of raw materials, and the reconstruction of the infrastructure that they need for their operations. Until recently, such externalization was considered normal practice and almost never became an issue for political authorities. However, the political atmosphere has now changed radically. We debate climate change and demand green and organic products. The idea that externalization is normal practice is a distant memory. The simple explanation for the origin of this debate about toxic disposal is that the world has exhausted most vacant public domains for the waste, with an obvious impact on public health. Strong new social movements call for an environmental cleanup. In addition, the large increase in general population has led to a worry about the exhaustion of shortage of natural resources, energy sources, water, forests, fish and meat. We fight about their allocation and we debate who should pay the bill for their renewal. Finally, products produced for sale on the world market require both transport and communication, which are today far more efficient and much, much faster. Since, however, the costs have risen considerably, we discuss who should pay the bill, the producers who use the infrastructure or the general public. Governments are thus faced with the demand that they assume a new and much larger role in detoxification, resource renewal, and infrastructure expansion. And to do this, however, they would have to increase taxes significantly. And to contain these costs, governments insist on more internalization of costs by entrepreneurs. However, both measures, increasing taxes and requiring more internalization of costs, affect significantly the margins of profit of enterprises. Finally, there is the rising level of taxation, the result of the expansion of government size and functions, which everybody wants, but for which no one wants to pay. There's equally an expansion of private taxation, that is, corruption of officials and the demands of organized mafias. There are ever more people to bribe and ever more room for mafiosi protection rackets. The biggest source of increased taxation, however, has been the result of the democratization of world politics. Populist social movements have fought to get the governments to provide education, health services, and lifelong revenue flows, what we call the welfare state. Over time, the demands for each have steadily expanded in both the levels of services demanded and the geographical locales in which the demands have been made. The global profit squeeze has been made worse. I'm afraid I now have to skip a major part of my paper on the changes in the geoculture and the world revolution of 1968 and its impact on everything in the world system. I'm sorry, but I'm trying to stick to the limits of time. I'll say in two sentences, there was a world revolution of 1968 by the world's social movements, which succeeded and failed. It succeeded in dethroning centrist liberalism, but it failed in changing the world. And what has happened since then is a massive offensive of the world right, which we call neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus. And this essentially involved a call for the rollback of all the benefits lower strata and weaker countries have obtained in the 1945 to 1970 period. Personnel costs were to be reduced, except for the top managers. Pressures to internalize costs of inputs were to be repealed. Taxes were to be lowered radically. Expenditures on welfare state demands were to be diminished, if not abolished. The size of government bureaucracies were to be cut. State enterprises were to be privatized. Weaker states were not to espouse developmentalism and import substitution, but to produce for export. And all these rules were enforced by the United States, the International Monetary Fund, and allied institutions. The governing slogan was that of Mrs. Thatcher: "There is no alternative." This program was remarkably successful for about 15 to 20 years until it ran out of steam. All around the world, the turn to the market as the sole guiding principle resulted in increased economic and social polarization, both within countries and between countries. The political balances began to move away from the neoliberalism, and there were three turning points in this political shift. The Zapatista uprising in Chiapas in 1994, the demonstrations at the Seattle meetings of the World Trade Organization in 1999, and the first World Social Forum at Porto Alegre in 2001. The lesson of Chiapas was that in one of the poorest regions of the world, there was an uprising that combined two messages. The first was that the Zapatistas did not seek state power in Mexico, but rather championed the rights of the indigenous people to lead an autonomous existence. The second was that the Zapatistas reached out worldwide to all oppressed groups of every conceivable variety in what they called Intergalactic Solidarity. The significance of Seattle was the potential global effectiveness of mass demonstrations. An unlikely coalition of trade unionists, environmentalists, and anarchists, most of whom were from the United States, furthermore, succeeded in bringing an intergovernmental meeting of considerable importance to a halt. The meeting of the World Trade Organization was intended to enact highly constraining rules about intellectual property. Not only were such rules not enacted by Seattle, but all attempts since then to do so, to revive this proposition, have failed miserably. And the significance of Porto Alegre was that a world coalition of diverse social movements convened successfully an international meeting based on horizontalist principles, one that has been repeated regularly ever since. They chose the name World Social Forum to indicate their opposition to one of the key institutions of the Washington Consensus, the World Economic Forum at Davos. What was now occurring was the framing of the active worldwide struggle about which which of the two poles of the bifurcation was to prevail. The question whether both sides was not in what way the capitalist system can be reformed. The question has become what would replace the system. And this is a question both for the 1% and for the 99% in that language coined in 2011. Of course, not everyone phrases it this way. Indeed, most people still assume that the system is continuing normally. And this is not wrong, but in the present situation, continuing to use the old rules, in fact, intensifies the structural crisis. For those on both sides who see clearly the nature of the struggle, the question becomes, what is the strategy by which they can win? And on this dilemma, there is division in both camps. To be sure, as complexity studies insist, the outcome is inherently unpredictable, but the options between which we can choose can be sketched in broad terms. One choice is a system that reproduces in a non-capitalist form the three defining characteristics of the present system: hierarchy, exploitation, and polarization. The other choice is a type of system that has never yet existed, one that is relatively democratic and relatively egalitarian. I shall use symbolic names for the two possibilities. I call one the spirit of Davos and the other the spirit of Porto Alegre. And we can try to discern the internal debates in both camps as to the desirable and most effective strategy. The camp of the spirit of Davos is deeply divided. One group favors the strategy of harsh repression and has no doubt been organizing the network of armed enforcers to crush opposition. But there is another group who do not believe that repression is effective in the long run. They favor the De Lampedusa strategy of changing everything so that nothing changes. They talk meritocracy, green capitalism, more equity, more diversity, the open hand to the rebellious, intending thereby to head off a system that would be based on relative democracy and relative equality. The camp of the spirit of Porto Alegre is also split. The horizontalists argue that the strategy of transition determines the outcome. They wish to maximize debate and search for relative consensus among the whole range of persons who seek the better world as they define it. They emphasize what is called a civilizational crisis and reject growth as a primary objective. Rather, they favor realizing some rational balance of social objectives. But there are those in this camp who argue that one cannot win political battles other than by organized strength, and this requires some kind of vertical organization. Furthermore, this group also emphasizes the importance of achieving significant immediate economic growth in the South in order to have the wherewithal to redistribute benefits. The resulting picture is therefore not one of a simple two-sided structure, but rather of a political field with four groups, and that is, of course, very confusing to everyone. The confusion is at one and the same time intellectual, moral, and political. There's a moral choice that each of us has to make. There is no apolitical, technocratic answer to such a question. There is not even a purely intellectual answer. We must turn here to our values as we have internalized them, and in the end, we act politically on the basis of these values. But we can say is that history is on nobody's side. What we may all fail to choose the best political tactics to pursue our values. Looking back in the future, we may regret errors in how we acted politically. Since the outcome is inherently and not extrinsically unpredictable, we have at the very best a 50-50 chance of getting the kind of world system we prefer. But this is as much reason for optimism as it is for pessimism. May I say that the part that I had to skip is rather important in my opinion, and I urge you to read the text, which will be available, I understand, quite shortly, both in English and in Chinese, for your perusal. I thank you very much.